Hi, and welcome. Thank you all for joining us. This is Witness from the Border. This is a dispatch of what is happening from the ground. My name is Jorge Palacios Jr., and I'm so happy to be joined by Zoe Martins from the Kino Border Initiative. Zoe, thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, of course. Thank you everyone for tuning in, and we have a lot to talk about today, so happy to be here.
We do, in fact, have a lot to talk about. Um, so, we're talking about the end of Title 42, which as many of you know that are tuning in, is this policy that has been in place since March of 2020. It was put in place by the Trump administration as part of the public health emergency, and it has stopped any asylum process from proceeding. All right, there's over the last 3 years, after a lot of battles in the courts and experts in the medical and policy fields have denounced Title 42, we are about to see uh, the end of it, right? As this public health emergency lifts next week on May 11th. So I guess to just get into it, Zoe, what have the past 3 years been like?
Yeah, thanks, Jorge. It's a great question, and to respond. I'm actually going to take us back 5 years, more or less, because really over these past 5 years, there have been these nonstop attacks on the asylum system. Attacks that started before Title 42 and attacks that look like they're going to continue even after Title 42. So I work at Kino Border Initiative, as you mentioned. And at KBI, most people we see are arriving at the border and trying to follow the processes that are made available to them by the US government. But unfortunately, our immigration system is so out of date that many people who want to migrate to the US, maybe to be with family members, to work in the US, they don't have a clear cut way to do that when they arrive at the US Mexico border. But today we're going to be talking more specifically about folks who are seeking asylum and seeking protection. And it's important to point out that seeking asylum is protected by both US and international law. It's something that we might be kind of surprised to remember after seeing all these nonstop attacks on the asylum system. But I want to start there that seeking asylum has been recognized as a right since the 1951 Refugee Convention. And the US signed on to this convention right after World War II and the Holocaust occurred. And part of this came from the fact that during the Holocaust, the US received, boats full of people who were fleeing parts of Europe and sent many of these boats back to the countries that they were fleeing persecution and death. And so, kind of in a response to that, the US and the global community really said, we need a system that will protect people, that will prevent them from being sent back to their homes where they might face persecution, their lives or freedom might be at risk. But despite this being an internationally and nationally recognized right, there have been these nonstop policies trying to make the asylum process as difficult as possible, closing the border to people who are fleeing from danger and persecution and preventing them from starting this process. So at Kino, we talk with hundreds of people every month who arrive at our migrant aid center and are trying to navigate these policies at the border. We are located in Nogales, Sonora, Mexico. We're about an hour south of Tucson, Arizona, right on the Mexico side. And at Kino, really our vision is migration with dignity. And there's a few different ways we try to work towards that vision. One of them being the direct humanitarian assistance and the holistic accompaniment that we give to folks who are arriving at our migrant aid center. We also facilitate education and encounter between migrant people and between other folks who come to visit our aid center to really try to inspire more people and communities towards solidarity with people in migration. And then we also do this policy advocacy side, both in the US and Mexico, trying to work towards more dignified immigration policies. And so one thing that I'll be able to speak to is we do kind of an intake interview with every person who arrives at Kino for the first time. And we ask some questions to learn more about what their experience has been like migrating, some of the reasons that they're migrating, And there we're able to learn a lot about what the lived experiences of some of these policies like Title 42 are. So I'll do a quick overview of what we've seen kind of from 2018 onwards, beginning with some policies under the Trump administration, the first of which was called metering, where US agents only were letting in a certain number of people each day to start an asylum process. And then they told people they were at capacity, and the rest of the folks had to put their names on the wait list and wait their turn, essentially. So to give an example, you know, if I were the mother of a family who was fleeing organized crime, death threats in my home state, you know, if I arrived to the US-Mexico border before March of 2018, I could present myself to the US authorities. I could explain that I'm seeking asylum, and they would start that process for me. They would, you know, assess the fear, take my fingerprints, do whatever background check they need to do, and then I would be able to go to my destination, maybe with family members in the US, and kind of wait for my court date in that process. But if I were that same person and I came after April of 2018 to the border, I could approach the port of entry, the US officials, but I would probably be told that they wouldn't have capacity to process me. I would have to go put my name on a wait list and wait the days, weeks, months until it was my turn. So that was what metering looked like. And then some other policies came on top of that as well. In 2019, Remain in Mexico, or also known as MPP, where any asylum seekers coming from a country other than Mexico, they could go to the border crossing and talk to US officials and explain they're seeking asylum. They would be given a paper with a court date on it, and then US officials would send them back to Mexico to wait until the day of their court. So we can imagine folks, families who are maybe waiting months on this metering wait list. Maybe it's finally their turn to go talk to the US official, and then they're only given a piece of paper and told to wait in Mexico until that date comes. So that sent a lot of people back to really dangerous conditions in border cities as well. And then lastly, we'll talk a little bit about Title 42, as you already mentioned, Jorge, that began in March of 2020, and really use this public health law to exclude asylum seekers specifically from entering the US. So from the beginning, we saw the discriminatory way that this law was used. And we saw the impacts on people who were trying to seek asylum. At Kino, we were kind of accompanying a family that had arrived back in November 2019 to seek asylum. And they approached the authorities, and they were put on a wait list under this metering policy. You know, by the spring, they had been waiting several months, and they received a phone call that was going to be their turn the next day to be processed into the United States. They were packing their bags. They were ready after this wait. But unfortunately, they received another phone call a little while later, and were told that because of Title 42 coming into place, they would no longer be able to cross, and they would have to wait indefinitely until they would have some sort of access to the asylum system. And in total, they had to wait 18 months at the US-Mexico border to be able to finally access their asylum process. So just kind of these layers of policy on top of one another, making seeking asylum more and more difficult over time. And one last thing, I could go on and on, obviously, about the impacts of Title 42. But, you know, at the same time, these policies are coming into place. At Kino, we're seeing more and more people arriving who are leaving due to violence. For example, in 2022, 75% of people arriving at Kino left their hometowns, their home states, countries due to violence. The vast majority. And another thing to point out is also around 80% of people arriving at Kino last year were Mexican nationals. And so that really meant that Title 42 was forcing all asylum seekers to be stranded in Mexico, and especially thinking about Mexican asylum seekers forced to wait in the same country that they're trying to flee for their own safety and protection. So it puts people in a lot of danger, both Mexican nationals and, you know, folks from other countries. So one example I'll give about being forced to wait in Mexico for folks who are from other countries, because those people are also targeted by organized crime, by Mexican authorities, who can kind of see that they're foreigners based on their appearance or their accent or what have you. And I met a man named Joaquin, who's from Venezuela, and he described Mexico actually as the worst part of his journey, even worse than the Darien Gap, which is, known as the most dangerous crossing through the jungle in Panama. And he had been stranded in Mexico for about 7 months. He had been kidnapped and extorted 3 times by Mexican authorities. And he explained that he was aware that Mexican authorities were actually working in collusion with organized crime to target him in some of these instances. So these are the kinds of conditions that people are forced to wait under, given these policies, given Title 42 in particular.
That really says a lot, I think. So given that, what are the implications of Title 42 lifting, right? Now that Title 42 is coming to an end, like what does that mean for migrants and for the whole system, right?
Yeah, for sure. I'll start with a little bit more about what's happening right now, because one other thing that's important to point out is that the current process right now, Title 42 still stands, but what there is this very limited exceptions process. So the general rule is that no one can seek asylum, but you can try to get an exception to Title 42 using the CBP-1 application, which is a smartphone application. And folks need to use this application to get an appointment, to have a day and a time to present at the border and then start their asylum process. And what this looks like is people who are having to try every morning to get onto this app and get an appointment, try for months on end, because the number of appointments available is really low. And we know that people have been forced to wait on the US-Mexico border for months, if not years. There are many people who need access to the asylum system, but there's a very small number of appointments. So that's what we're seeing right now, are folks trying to use this application to get an exception to Title 42, but we've seen how unfair and inequitable the CBP-1 application is, because the app requires people who are fleeing violence, fleeing persecution, to sit down and make an appointment. And most people don't have the luxury to kind of plan ahead to choose a date and a time. We're talking about people who are fleeing for their lives, for the lives of their children. So this application just puts up so many obstacles for especially the most vulnerable asylum seekers. We think about people maybe who can't read or write, people who speak an indigenous language or another language that's not supported on the application. And still, these people, the only way they can try to access asylum and protection is using this phone application. So one other person that comes to mind that I've met at Kino is a man named Benjamin, and he's an indigenous man from Guatemala. Spanish is his second language, and his first language is Quiche. And he came to Kino, unfortunately, after being physically assaulted by Border Patrol agents. He arrived injured at Kino, and he spent 8 months waiting for access to the asylum process, many months trying to get an appointment on the CBP-1 application. And he struggled with it for many reasons, kind of all the technological problems and glitches, Spanish being his second language. And he had to spend thousands of pesos, $130 to buy a smartphone that would be able to download this application. So we just see so many inequities based on the CBP-1 application. And what things will look like once Title 42 is lifted, the main change will be the policy behind why people are having to use the CBP-1 application. But it will not change the fact that people have to use this phone application to get an appointment to present at the port of entry. People won't be using the CBP-1 application to ask for an exception to Title 42 anymore, but they will have to use the CBP-1 application to seek asylum because of the Biden administration's proposed asylum ban that we're looking at and looks like will come into place right after May 11th.
Wow. I think, yeah, the CBP1 app is something that we are somewhat familiar with, right? But just knowing that that's going to continue, and the change of its purpose is really disheartening. I think we have a testimony of someone from KBI, so I think now is a good opportunity to listen to the voice of that person.
That sounds great. Thank you.
Me llamo Estela Rodríguez. Vengo de Guatemala porque vengo por persecución, porque allá es muy difícil estar, pues, porque mucha persecución, mucha discriminación. Porque nosotros ahora aquí, yo estoy aquí en Nogales. Vine desde octubre y no he pasado, aquí estoy sufriendo. Habemos muchas madres que traemos nuestros hijos y venimos sufriendo porque aquí está muy mal, pues aquí también nos están amenazando, aquí cobran mucho la renta, aquí pues ven que venimos del otro lado y nos cobran mucho. Dicen que si no tenemos, pues no nos podemos quedar y además no podemos trabajar porque no traemos credencial, no somos de aquí, sufrimos mucho con nuestros hijos. Desde que se abrió el CPB1, pues yo he intentado entrar ahí, pero casi vemos muchos que intentamos entrar ahí, pero no da, aparece error, aparece no hay cupo para una persona, no hay cupo para 3, y ahí vamos, pues no entra, cuesta mucho, con esta aplicación estamos sufriendo tanto porque no entra. No, porque aquí en México está muy peligro y no podemos pedir asilo porque es tan peligroso, toda la gente corre en peligro y nosotros también corremos peligros, hemos sido amenazados aquí. Entonces no, venimos pidiendo asilo para el otro lado. Que por favor tenga misericordia de nosotros porque nosotros estamos sufriendo mucho aquí y que nos dejen pasar por allá y pues es lo que queremos, pues no venimos a hacer malas cosas ni nada, simplemente venimos a pedir asilo, pues a pasar a que pues a dar un buen futuro para nuestros hijos.
Well, that's a very telling testimony. So I guess in light of that, right? What reflections do you have, Zoe? Right? What, now that Title 42 is lifting, right? What does this really look like?
Yeah, absolutely. Stella's testimony is very powerful. Just thinking about the fact that she and her family have been stranded since October. So many months of just kind of waiting, this indefinite wait of trying to seek asylum in the United States. And unfortunately, we hear testimonies like Estela's regularly at Kino of people who have been battling with the CBP1 application, who have been trying to use this super limited and dysfunctional pathway. And as we've been talking about, as Title 42 is coming to an end, unfortunately, Biden's proposed asylum ban is going to continue to put these really significant obstacles up for people who are trying to seek asylum. So what this will look like in practice is that the end of Title 42 isn't going to change really anything on the ground, because it's going to establish all these requirements that asylum seekers must comply with to be able to access the asylum process. So overall, what this new rule, this asylum ban would look like, it would continue to require asylum seekers to use the CBP1 application to schedule an appointment. And it would have these other kind of layers built in of other obstacles. For example, if there are people who are fleeing countries other than Mexico, and these people have not gotten an appointment on CBP-1, and they try to cross in between ports of entry or try to cross in the desert, U.S. agents will assume that they're ineligible for asylum, even if they have, a claim, because they will need to have first asked for asylum in another country that they transited through. So kind of harkening back to the transit ban that Trump attempted to put into place for quite a while, forcing people to try to seek asylum in countries they're passing through where they might not have safety either, where there might not be, full and fair asylum processes. But these are some of the barriers that this new asylum ban would put up. And I think about Estela and her testimony that she just shared as someone from Guatemala. She would be forced to get an appointment on the CBP-1 app. And if not, this kind of transit ban would be in place for her. The expectation would be that she would seek asylum in Mexico, even though she said in her testimony that her and her family have received threats in Mexico, that they do not have safety there either. So we're very concerned about this new ban and the obstacles that would be put in place. And we're not alone in that. I mean, the public is very opposed to this asylum ban. And that's something that we saw during the process, where folks in the public could submit comments, kind of giving their opinion and feedback on this proposed rule. And the US government received over 50,000 comments about this new rule. And nearly 80% of them expressed opposition and expressed, grave concern about what this would mean for asylum seekers. So there's a lot of opposition, but unfortunately, the Biden administration only really has to, read through and consider those comments, and they could still and probably will make the decision to implement this ban, regardless of public opinion about it. And the rule itself talks about incentivizing regular pathways and de-incentivizing irregular pathways, such as crossing through the desert, right? But we're talking about people who are fleeing violence and persecution, threats to their lives. These are situations where people don't necessarily have the resources and the luxury to choose how they flee, to choose when they flee. So the pathways that the Biden administration is trying to make available to people, like the CBP-1 appointment process, they're simply not viable for most people who are fleeing persecution. It's not viable for someone fleeing death threats to wait for months and months trying to use this dysfunctional app. So we're really concerned. CBP-1 cannot be the only way for people to seek asylum, for all the inequities we've talked about, for the way that it really disadvantages the most vulnerable asylum seekers as well. Just basic access to a smartphone can be a really big challenge. People who have made long and perilous journeys are often robbed. They're often robbed of their cell phones, for example. And you need to have thousands of Mexican pesos to buy an iPhone and Android, something that can support this application. So just at that very basic kind of financial accessibility, the application disadvantages those folks who are most vulnerable. And the other part of the rule that I mentioned, this kind of transit ban, right, of if folks don't have an appointment and try to cross in the desert, they will be ineligible for asylum if they haven't first tried to seek asylum in a transit country. And this also puts people in a lot of danger. Just thinking about Mexico as an example of a transit country, people coming from other parts of Central America, South America, cross through Mexico. But there isn't a completely full and fair asylum process in Mexico for people to use. The Mexican government's asylum processing agency the acronym is COMAR, so we'll call it COMAR. They're unfortunately very under-resourced for the amount of asylum applications that they've been getting over the past many years. There are not asylum agents from COMAR present along all of the border. They're not present in all of Mexico because there's not enough resources. And in those locations, the Mexican government actually relies on Mexican immigration, the enforcement wing, to do these asylum interviews. So we can think about how that would not be a fair process if you have to sit down and have an interview with, you know, the equivalent of, say, ICE in the United States, who's in charge of immigration enforcement, in charge of removal. That should not be the person doing an asylum interview. But that's what this process would look like in many parts of Mexico, for example. And we also know that there's not a lot of safety for migrant people in Mexico. There are unfortunately many examples of systemic discrimination and persecution by both organized crime and by Mexican authorities against people who are migrating. And we saw this clearly illustrated in the recent tragic fire in Ciudad Juarez, where migrants were detained in a Mexican immigration center and the Mexican authorities did not allow them to leave the burning building. And it resulted in a really big loss of life. So these examples really clearly illustrate that there is systemic persecution against migrants in Mexico, and we cannot ask people to stay in a country where they do not have safety and do not have a full and fair asylum process. So, you know, taking all of these things together, as we see, it's really, really sad and tragic that the end of Title 42 isn't going to change this current system. It's not going to change these obstacles that are in place for people seeking asylum. And it's going to be a really confusing time. This next week, a few weeks, months, we're also concerned about how migrants and asylum seekers are going to get access to trustworthy, accessible information about what's happening. We can definitely imagine that the end of Title 42 is going to give people a lot of false hope and kind of false ideas that traffickers and coyotes will probably take advantage of, and, you know, tell people that they can now seek asylum at the border, when that is still not going to be true, given this asylum ban that Biden is going to put into place. So it's a really difficult and confusing time of, you know, finally having the end of this discriminatory policy of Title 42, but at the same time, we're not going to see the necessary changes. We're not going to see a dignified and fair asylum process still. Okay, I think we're having trouble hearing you.
Apologies. Yeah, I think obviously this is not a good situation, but it is good that we are, you know, talking about this. That being said, you know, what is the thing that people should, you know, take with them from this webinar? What should people know about, you know, we've discussed a lot, and the, you know, Title 42 is and the ramifications of its ending. It can be hard to sort of understand, right? There's just so many factors of how this affects asylum. So, you know, what should people know about the reality of the end of Title 42? What should people take with them from this webinar?
Yeah, absolutely. It's, like I said, it is a very confusing time. These past 5 years have been just nonstop attacks and trying to figure out what is really happening with the asylum system. So just to kind of reflect on what we've been talking about, I would say a few things. First, you know, Title 42 has been in place for nearly 3.5 years now, and that has been 3.5 years too long, right? That this policy was used to discriminate against asylum seekers from the beginning, and it never served a legitimate public health interest. So I want to start there, that Title 42 needs to be lifted. It has been here for 3.5 years too long. But at the same time, we can't celebrate yet where we're at with the asylum system. We do not yet have restored access to the asylum process as we should. And that is because of this asylum ban that will come into place as soon as Title 42 is lifted. And as I mentioned before, the reliance on this CBP-1 application is a grave injustice. CBP-1 cannot be the only way for people to seek asylum, because it's not accessible, it's not equitable, it's not available to people who are the most vulnerable, and it's discriminatory. So this cannot be the solution to the asylum process. We cannot rely on CBP-1 as the sole way to access this process. And I'll also take advantage to point out a few other, well, really one other obstacle that the Biden administration also wants to roll out. You know, this is a long rule that has been written up. We're going to see the final version soon, but there are many obstacles built into this rule to make it as difficult as possible to seek asylum and to navigate the process. So one other example I'll just bring up that we haven't mentioned yet is this idea of putting people through fast-tracked credible fear interviews. So people who are seeking asylum, one of the first kind of steps in the process would be that they need to have a credible fear interview. And US agents sit down and ask some kind of preliminary questions about why they're seeking asylum, what the situation is in their home location. And asylum seekers would have to pass this interview to kind of move on in the process. The agents are trying to figure out if the fear they have is credible, is believable, if the persecution they're talking about is actually likely to happen. So that's what they're trying to figure out in this interview. And what the Biden administration has already started doing, they want to fast track this process, make it as fast as possible, which has a lot of negative implications for due process, for having a full and fair asylum process. What would happen, and it has already started to happen for some folks, these interviews would take place within 1 to 2 days, 24 to 48 hours after arriving to Border Patrol custody. So super fast. You've, been through a really traumatic experience of fleeing your home location. Kind of as soon as you get there, you're put in custody, a short-term detention center. And within a day or 2 days, you're having to have this interview. And that interview is going to happen within this detention center, within Border Patrol custody. And some things to point out about that, the conditions of that custody are that lawyers have no access. Lawyers cannot physically arrive to those locations. They're closed to lawyers and closed to the public, obviously. And the conditions are deplorable. I mean, we've heard for many years about the conditions in these kind of short-term detention centers with insufficient food, insufficient access to showers, to hygiene products, things like the lights aren't turned off at night. So how can you actually get a night's sleep if, the next morning you have this really important interview you have to do and you have really limited access to a lawyer? It could only be kind of through a phone call. They couldn't actually come in person. And, in these conditions that are traumatizing and undignified, that's where you're expected to do this interview that's going to determine if you can move forwards in the asylum process or not. So this idea of kind of fast tracking these interviews is just one other example of all these obstacles that this new asylum ban would put into place. And so we're obviously a long ways still from having a dignified and fair asylum system. The end of Title 42 is long due, but this cannot be the end of the fight for a dignified asylum system.
That's very well said. So the feeling that I have in having this conversation, right, is I think the feeling that a lot of people have, right? What can I do? What can we do? What sort of actions can we take collectively to help in any capacity? So yeah, what are some next steps that people can take? Yeah,
that's a great question. And I think, I'll start with where I left off. I mean, the first thing just generally is that we have to continue to speak out against these restrictions on asylum, right? Unfortunately, with the end of Title 42, these restrictions are not going to come to an end. So we can't accept this as the new normal, right? We need to continue fighting for restoration of access to the asylum process. And as we've discussed, Biden's new ban, CBP-1, those things do not provide us with a fair asylum system. So yeah, what are some more kind of concrete steps that folks can take who want to continue in this fight with us? I'll start with one that, at KBI, we really place a lot of importance on listening and learning from folks who are directly impacted by these policies, people who are arriving every day at our migrant aid center. And people really generously share their testimonies with us. And a lot of people want others to know their stories. They want others to know their experiences. And so one way that anyone can do this from wherever you are located is to read one of the testimonies of people at Kino that we have on our website, and will be linked in the video description. And we have some testimonies available there that you can read through. You can witness these testimonies, either by yourself in your home, or you could organize it in a group meeting and kind of, read a story together, and commit to praying for that person and to sharing their testimony with other people in your lives. This is a really important step to continuing to raise consciousness, awareness of what migrants are experiencing day to day, of what asylum seekers are experiencing, and how these policies impact their daily lives. So this is a really important step that everyone can do to really just welcome more people in their community into this knowledge, into listening to folks who really are living what these policies mean. So that's one thing everyone can do and can commit to doing. And there's a few other action steps as well that I want to point out. There are also things that are, moving nationally, national legislation, right? That's another way to look at this, is really from that congressional advocacy standpoint. And one thing that I want to point out is that these challenges in navigating the asylum system, they don't stop once people are processed into the US, unfortunately. Asylum is a long and grueling, confusing process. And people are kind of in limbo for months, if not years. Once they're in the US, they're waiting for their court date before an immigration judge. During this time, they don't have access to any public benefits. And they often don't have access to a work permit for at least 6 months. So this puts people in a really difficult situation of what you do while you're in this limbo. How do you provide for yourself and for your family? And so there is an act that's being introduced called the Asylum Seeker Work Authorization Act of 2023 that would try to address this and try to make this waiting time a little bit less difficult. And what it would do would allow people who are waiting for their asylum court date to apply for a work permit after only 1 month, rather than having to wait 6 months to apply for this work permit. And it would allow people to provide for themselves. It would, allow local businesses to employ people who probably have some great work experience and could contribute to that local community. So this is another thing that would help asylum seekers in this long process. And so folks can reach out directly to their members of Congress, to their representatives and senators, and encourage them to express their support for this and encourage them to sign on to this Work Authorization Act, for the reasons that we just talked about, of making this system a little bit more equitable, a little bit more dignified, that people could provide for themselves while they're waiting for their court date. So that's one other kind of concrete example of something that's out there, an act that's in the works, that we can all call upon our elected officials to support as well. And one other idea that comes to mind as another kind of more concrete action step is thinking about people who are going to continue to be arriving to Kino, in these weeks, in these months. And unfortunately, they're going to arrive and be faced with these obstacles that we've been talking about, namely, having to use the CBP-1 application. So one thing that we can also do is try to increase people's access to smartphones to just be able to use the CBP-1 application, because people arrive without phones. People don't necessarily have the financial ability to go and buy one. So, while CBP-1 is a really insufficient step towards restoring asylum, we also want to try to help as many people as possible to be able to use what's available. So at Kino, we're always accepting donations of smartphones that we can help distribute to folks who are arriving in Nogales and who don't have their own smartphone. And this is just one small way to try to respond to the inequity of the CBP-1 application. And so we have also on our website and on a slide kind of some the prerequisites for what kind of phones can use the CBP-1 application. But, a long list of, iPhones, Androids that you might not be using anymore, you might have in your home and don't know what to do with. We will happily accept those donations at KBI and get those phones to people who are arriving and need access to a smartphone. So this is just a list of the supported models, but there's a whole wide range of phones that support this app, and smartphones are expensive. So this is definitely a concrete step that could really help an individual person, help an individual family who's trying to navigate this process. So those are kind of a range of things folks can do to get involved, to stay involved, from talking with your community, from sharing testimonies with your community, to donating an old phone that you might not be using, to calling members of Congress and asking for their support on the act we just talked about. So we are really appreciative of everyone who's been listening, been tuning in, and we hope that you'll join us in taking some of these action steps, and then continuing to speak out against these obstacles, against these attacks on asylum that continue.
Thank you very much, Zoe. Thank you all for everyone who's tuned in to this webinar, right? Taking the time to really learn a little bit more about the reality of what's happening with asylum at the U.S.-Mexico border. Yes, thank you so much, Zoe. It's always a pleasure.
Yes, thank you, Jorge. I really appreciate it. It's like you said, it's important to have this space to just talk about what's happening. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of good news still, but we need to be knowledgeable about this and be able to continue speaking out about what the reality is, about what the end of Title 42 is really going to mean. So very appreciative for the space and for everyone who took the time to tune in with us.
Most definitely. Well, thank you. Thank you for everyone that's tuned in. Hopefully we'll see some cell phones sent to KBI soon. A big shipment.
Yes, that would be great.